Okay, so this is the the second of the three teachings, essentially. Marxism in Ireland, 1841 to 1923. I think, as I mentioned at the end of the last sort of session, I picked 1841 as the it's the start of it's called Peel's second ministry. Really, I suppose it's the first time that Robert Peel, who's a conservative, is substantially in power. I chose this, I think, partially because, again, as I say, I want to sort of provide a sort of broader educational resource, I suppose. And Peel is the sort of most significant really figure in British politics of the 19th century. And I thought this was the easiest way to address the issue. So Peel is excuse me, the son of a sort of textile sort of manufacturer. Excuse me. He begins actually his political career in a rotten borough in Ireland, and his first real substantive position is in the sort of essentially chief secretary to the Lord Lieutenant. He's the one that actually sort of runs the administration of Ireland from Dublin. And one of the things he sort of the main things that sort of he establishes is the what is the Irish Constabulary, and later becomes the Royal Irish Constabulary, which is essentially a sort of functions as a police force, though of course it's a sort of quasi-military esque organisation with military style uniforms and so on, and functions then primarily as the sort of the sort of the sort of chief, if you will, special body of armed men in the sort of day-to-day sort of running of Ireland from this point in 1814, this sort of 1813, 1814, this period onwards. He then obviously later then, as the Home Secretary, obviously establishes the Metropolitan Police here in London. As the sort of many ways the first sort of police force, modern police force essentially. He has this sort of long history of sort of being ideologically in many cases a sort of high Tory, then switching to quite sort of radically different perspectives and positions. For example, he initially was he was an opponent of Catholic emancipation. He was opposed initially to free trade and so on, to the Great Reform Act. But eventually, he really sort of shifts quite rapidly, and sort of really he sort of is the sort of most symptomatic expression of adapting to the sort of new requirements of the state, the new Bonapartist state that emerges in the 19th century. After the Great Reform Act of 1832, in 1834 he publishes the Tamworth Manifesto, which is in many ways the sort of founding document of the modern Conservative Party. He becomes an advocate of what he calls modest reform. he begins to sort of like rebrand the Conservative Party to like move away from the like landed aristocracy in a certain way. And then he becomes Prime Minister then in 1841. And it's really here that in a sense it's under Peel you see the sort of consolidation of Bonapartism in Britain, which is, I think I said you sort of like it already sort of begun to emerge like the 1830s under sort of the Whigs.
Wellington.
Wellington was
The Iron Duke.
Well, he wasn't Prime Minister for very long, in fairness. But Peel and Wellington are like joined at the hip in many ways. Wellington's like his, patron. Really, I'm saying like after the Greek Reform Act, which is in an interesting sense. You mentioned Wellington. After this, during Peel's first ministry, his 100-day ministry in like 1834-35. The king actually wanted to appoint Wellington as the Prime Minister, as he had done previously. But Wellington refused and told him that it had to be Peel as a member of the House of Commons, an elected like representative. It's in the wake of the Great Reform Act. But anyway, that's just sort of a side story. He imposes obviously an income tax, which had been sort of introduced briefly during the Napoleonic Wars, but then abolished. He sort of reintroduces an income tax. One of his like most well-known pieces of legislation is one of a series, obviously. One of the famous like Factory Act, insisting on like regulatory standards and sort of safety standards and so on in factories. Opposed in many cases by capitalists who, excuse me, whom Peel might have been like presumed would support, given his like family background and the fact that he was like the first, in a sense, non-aristocratic like prime minister. But really, it's just, as I say, the sort of like the clarification of like Bonapartism in Britain. This disciplining of capital, as well as like the disciplining of labour. Excuse me. Excuse me. Then obviously, with the onset of like the potato famine, the Irish potato famine in like 1845, Peel firstly sort of attempts to sort of rather covertly buy sort of maize from the United States and sort of distribute it sort of discreetly, and later to then eventually like repeal the Corn Laws, which is the sort of it like splits the sort of Conservative Party and is in many ways the like final like sundering of the apparent more like moderate like Peelites and the sort of like high Tories, in one sense. And it is the people like Gladstone that who like resigned from the Conservative Party. These like Peelites would later go on to merge with the Whigs to form the Liberal Party. However, of course, I would also say that Disraeli, for example, is also sort of himself would have actually supported repealing the Corn Laws in a he actually thought he thought it was necessary, but he opposed the sort of Peel in Parliament, largely for personal reasons. Essentially, if you will, what Disraeli then spends the next like 40 years doing, I suppose, is Peelizing the high Tories, I suppose, or like Bonapartising, turning them into Bonapartists, if you will.
Well, the famous quote is he dished the Whigs and educated
the Tories, yes.
Past reform.
Exactly.
But the biggest reform of all was to become what he is from what he was.
Yes. Good old darling Dizzy. Anyway. It's also, as like a side note, it's also his like betrayal of Peel, which sort of like Gladstone like initially like never forgives him for. They had very little to do with each other up to that point, and that obviously like then dominates politics in a sense for the next like 40 years. But in terms of like Ireland more specifically, you see a sort of really under Peel, you see a crystallisation of what had begun under the Whigs, but which, i.e. the sort of for example, one of the most controversial elements of his like ministry was what's called the Maynooth Grant, i.e. it's subsidising like Catholic seminaries in Ireland, which was a sort of this sort of the emergence really of this like hesitation on the part of the state to confront the Catholic Church openly in like any way, which had like previously not been like an issue. It's also after the sort of after the Catholic emancipation, O'Connell moves on then to his next like political sort of demand is to repeal the Act of Union. Well, this is his like demand, which he sort of I think marks as an excellent quote, sort of addressing the sort of like political sort of situation from the 1830s on.
Where's it from?
It's from. This is from the like an article like Ireland's Revenge.
What do you know what year?
Oh, what year was it? Was it? The years left me anyway.
In the 50s.
I think I'm positive it's the 50s. No, God, anyway, it's gone. Ireland has revenged herself upon England, socially by bestowing an Irish quarter on every English industrial, maritime or commercial town of any size, and politically by furnishing the English Parliament with an Irish brigade. In 1833, Daniel O'Connell decried the Whigs as base, bloody and brutal. In 1835 he became the most efficient tool of the Whigs. Although the English majority was opposed to the Melbourne administration, it remained in office from April 1835 to August 1841 because of the support it received from O'Connell and his Irish brigade. What intervened between O'Connell of 1833 and O'Connell of 1835? An agreement known as the Litchfield House Contract, according to which the Whig cabinet granted O'Connell government patronage in Ireland, and O'Connell promised the Whig cabinet the votes of the Irish Brigade in Parliament. And then different. This was like the follow-up to that. See what yes. In like the same sort of a follow-up like quote from a bit further along. The Whigs used the Irish Brigade to dominate the English Parliament, and they toss posts and salaries to the brigade. The Catholic clergy permits the one to buy and the other to sell, on condition that both acknowledge the power of the clergy and help to extend and strengthen it. It is, however, a very remarkable phenomenon that in the same measure as the Irish influence in the political sphere grows in England, the Celtic influence in the social sphere decreases in Ireland. Both the Irish quarter in Parliament and the Irish clergy seem to be equally unaware of the fact that behind their back, the Irish society is being radically transformed by an Anglo-Saxon revolution. In the course of this revolution, the Irish agricultural system is being replaced by the English system, the system of small tenures by big tenures. The modern capitalist is taking the place of the old landowner. and this is sort of the wake of the potato famine from 1845 to 52. This Anglo-Saxon revolution takes place after that.
Meaning industrialisation.
Well, I mean, the sort of it's still like sort of agricultural in a sense, but
conglomeration.
Right, and the sort of, as he says, the replacement of landlords with capitalists. As to who, like controls the sort of to like the money and rents and so on, like excuse me. Excuse me. So that is between so O'Connell and the Irish Brigade, as Marx calls them, support the Whigs in Parliament. And the Marx also points out elsewhere that the moment the Whigs are like ousted, O'Connell returns to demanding repeal, which he sort of repeal of the Act of Union, which he had dropped in the 1830s after Peel becomes Prime Minister, and then he sort of picks it up again in 1841. But Peel, aware perhaps that O'Connell attempts to use the sort of same tactics he'd used with Catholic emancipation, large monster meetings, his form of brinksmanship, and Peel both calls his bluff and attempts to declares one of these meetings illegal and dares him to essentially actually go forward with the sort of violence that he's implicitly threatens, which doesn't happen. So O'Connell's credibility sort of suffers. And Peel also, as I said, excuse me. He attempts to sort of subvert this in other ways by, again creating new universities and allowing the Catholic theology to be taught as opposed to official Anglican theology and so on. And then it's really in as I said, obviously, Peel repeals the Corn Laws in 1846 and is then ousted. And it's after this that it's from this sort of crisis with O'Connell that you have the emergence of O'Connell and his supporters you might call Old Ireland. You have the emergence of what then becomes known as Young Ireland, as a sort of more radical element, and initially demanding again the repeal of the Act of Union, but then sort of moving quite quickly through 1847 towards excuse me, I'm seeing the sort of prospect of revolution in Europe more broadly, and sort of beginning to agitate for that in Ireland, and there is a sort of an attempted rising in Ireland in 1848, which partially due to in large part due to the 1847 being the worst year of the famine, never gets off the ground, and they sort of crushed very easily. I think it is sometimes often referred to as the Battle of the Widow McGrory's Cabbage Patch.
The Battle of what?
The Widow, I think, McGrory's Cabbage Patch. Nothing much happens at all. So they're sort of Young Ireland is then is put down, and obviously so it's younger members flee overseas, and several of them flee to Paris in the wake of the 1848 revolutions there, and it's actually it's a gift actually from France. The Irish tricolour, the green, white and orange. The truce between green and orange, which is what it's supposed to symbolise, is a gift from French radicals in 1847. And they sort of flee to Paris then in the wake of failed 1848 revolutions in France, and they sort of learn from a lot of the secret societies there, the sort of organisational sort of skills to build their own secret society, and then they sort of this leads eventually to in 1850 it's the founding of what in Ireland is called the IRB, and it's sister organisation in the United States being the Fenian Brotherhood, and Fenian is a word then that is used sort of colloquially to refer to both of them.
And IRB stands for?
Well, IRB, there's a sort of initially there's this slight ambiguity which persists really up until towards the end of the 19th century between whether it stands for Irish Revolutionary Brotherhood or Irish Republican Brotherhood, and it's the latter which eventually wins out as the definition, and they are they sort of inherit very much the sort of memory of 1798 and the sort of United Irishmen. They're this secular. They demand a secular independence republic with universal suffrage, and this is in the 1850s, 1860s. Land reform and so on. Excuse me. So there, and there was another actually attempted sort of uprising in 1867, attempting to use sort of veterans of the U.S. Civil War. Neither had been sort of old Fenians, attempting to recruit the sort of Irish immigrants to the United States to return and launch a rising. And this is also crushed in 1867. And the IRB then sort of wanes a bit towards the end of the following this. But I suppose the other sort of point, this is one strand, if you will, to just bear in mind. Moving towards the end of the 19th century, you have this secret society, of it's secular Republican sort of organization sort of in play, I suppose. Indeed, Marx has also also a quote actually about the Fenians. Excuse me. This is also, by the way, from I mentioned the quote earlier about Cromwell. The sort of notes for a lecture that he didn't give to the communist educational committee, I think it was, of the International Working Men's Association. That's where this comes from. What is distinctive of Fenianism? Actually, it originates from the Irish Americans. They are the initiators and the leaders. But in Ireland, the movement took root and is still really rooted only in the mass of the people, the lower orders. That is what characterizes it. In all earlier Irish movements, the people followed the aristocracy or middle-class men, and always the Catholic churchmen. The Anglo-Irish chiefs and the priests during the rising against Cromwell, even James II, King of England, in the war against William III, the Protestant Republicans of Ulster, Wolfe Tone and Lord Fitzgerald in the 1798 Revolution, and finally in this century, the bourgeois O'Connell, supported by the Catholic clergy, which also played a leading role in all earlier movements, excepting 1798. The Catholic clergy decreed a ban on Fenianism, which it did not lift until it realised that its attitude would deprive it of all influence on the Irish masses. That's just, I said, one sort of strand to bear in mind. You also have the firstly the sort of excuse me, you still have yes. Just one other quote from Marx. Excuse me. This also reflecting on the 1830s. The Catholic problem too could be used only occasionally. Since the Catholic emancipation, it could no longer serve as the permanent propaganda theme. Thus, the Irish politicians were compelled to do what O'Connell had always avoided and refused to do, that is, to explore the real cause of the Irish malady, and to make the relations of landed property and their reform the election slogan. In other words, a slogan that would help them get into the House of Commons. But having taken their seats in the House, they used the rights of tenants, etc., just as formally the repeal as a means to conclude a new Lichfield House contract. That's in the 1850s.
Who's that about?
That's about after O'Connell's death, his followers in the 1850s in
who was
Parliament.
successfully elected to Parliament. But so there's a kind of split from after O'Connell's death between Young Ireland and those who go into the House of Commons.
Well, it's sort of slightly before his death. You have this split and the sort of re-emergence of, you have the emergence of Young Ireland, and then eventually of the IRB and the Fenianism.
And the IRB and the Fenianism comes out of Young Ireland.
Yes, both through emigres and sort of So that's one strand. But then you also have these Irish politicians, as he talks about, and there are sort of various groupings, but eventually they coalesce towards 1879 into what then becomes known as the Irish Parliamentary Party, led by Charles Stewart Parnell, as well as, of course, he says, addressing the real sort of issue of land reform in Ireland, which is that you have the starting really in the late 1860s, what's known as the Land War, and the founding a bit later on of what becomes the Irish Land League, which is a war for fair rents, no evictions and so on. Ultimately for excuse me, ultimately the demand is that down with landlordism, and that the toilers, i.e. the workers of the land, should own the land, and this then becomes the sort of one of the main political sort of drives towards even the early 20th century, and there was various various bills introduced to address this problem by the Liberals predominantly. But sort of what's interesting is that the Land League is also nominally headed by Parnell, though there are a lot of excuse me,
the
actual
leader of the Irish Parliamentary
Party.
Which are the kind of legacy O'Connellites.
Right. He's also the sort of the head of the Land League. However, there are a lot of, this in the 1870s after the failed rebellion of 1867, there are a lot of Fenians, sort of who actually do the organising of the Land League. It was founded, one of its main founders was called Michael Davitt. He was also I think one of the founders of the Fabian Society as well. And so there's a sort of there is an alliance then, if you will, between the sort of more radical elements in the Land League and Parnell's Parliamentary Party. Excuse me. And then I should also say that one of the other sort of issues, up to I think 1868, was the official disestablishment of the Church of Ireland, whereby previously everyone had to pay a 10% tithe to the Church of Ireland, whether they were Anglicans or Dissenters or Catholics. That was also one of the sort of political sort of issues, sort of up, particularly the tithe wars, it's called, in the 1830s, as well. But then you have the re-emergence with the Irish Parliamentary Party of what then becomes known as Home Rule, i.e. the establishment of excuse me again. It means the establishment of a Home Rule, i.e. an Irish Parliament in Dublin for Irish affairs. This is the demand, and they sort of convinced Gladstone of it. He attempts the first attempted Home Rule Bill, his first attempt in 1886, which meets very excuse me, with very serious opposition from the sort of Ulster Protestants, and there was a resurgence then in the Orange Order, which had waned in the sort of first half of the sort of 1830s through to the sort of 1870s, and also a split in the Liberal Party between what then become known as the Liberal Unionists and the sort of Liberal Party proper, and eventually the Liberal Unionists will later merge with the Conservative Party, to form excuse me, the Conservative and Unionist Party, as it is today. Then there is a second attempted Home Rule Bill introduced in 1793, which also fails.
1893.
Sorry, yes. Oh God. Anyway, and both times they're it's defeated. The first time it's defeated in the Commons by these Liberal Unionists, and the second time there's a majority in the Commons, so it's then defeated in the House of Lords. And particularly there is a sort of a split actually between the first and second Home Rule Bills of the Irish Parliamentary Party, nominally over the fact that Parnell was living with a married woman, though there were perhaps broader political dissatisfactions with the Parnell's leadership and the sort of failure of the first Home Rule Bill. So there's a split in the Irish Parliamentary Party, which essentially incapacitated in the 1890s and into the start of the 20th century. And there's a move then towards a certain retreat from politics towards broader civil society sort of organisations. So you have the founding of the Gaelic League for the promotion of the Irish language in particular, but Gaelic culture more broadly, which had obviously had still been in fairly widespread use up until the Anglo-Saxon Revolution, as Marx terms it. You also have then, probably the most important of the organisations then is the GAA, the Gaelic Athletic Association, for the promotion of native Gaelic sports, which is in the first case of the Gaelic League, it isn't actually founded by members of the IRB, but is then quite quickly infiltrated by members of the IRB who move it in a very nationalist direction, or a more overtly political nationalist direction. And it is members of the IRB who then found the GAA, and also move it in a sort of quite overt nationalist direction. So that's sort of the state of play up until the early 20th century. I suppose then, excuse me, to circle back around, I suppose, to how Marx addressed the question of Ireland, and why, for example, why they, for example, supported the essentially Irish independence. They sort of wrote a letter, for example, from the International Working Men's Association requesting that excuse me, 3 Fenians who were sentenced to be hanged in Manchester be sort of pardoned, as an example, but more broadly their support for Irish independence. So I'd like to turn to that before we then move on to the into the 20th century then. Excuse me. And Marx addresses this question in various places, but one of the perhaps the best, obviously, is a letter to Siegfried Meyer and August Vogt in 1870, via GT, in which he writes, After studying the Irish question for many years, I have come to the conclusion that the decisive blow against the English ruling classes, and it will be decisive for the workers' movement all over the world, cannot be delivered in England, but only in Ireland. On January the 1st, 1870, the General Council issued a confidential circular drawn up anyway, I cut out that bit, but anyway, excuse me, I think I seem to have misplaced one of my pages.
Found it.
What the?
Yeah. So I give it to you. I don't know how much you. I'll give it to you.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I mean, it's okay.
You sure?
Is that the quote you want to read?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I can read it to Rory.
There you
Yeah.
go.
cheers. So I have like most of it here, but anyway.
I can't remember how to do the text piece.
It's okay. No, anyway, I think actually, just let me see if I found the actual. Yes, okay, anyway, it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I found the actual. So, anyway, start again then. After studying the Irish question for many years, I have come to the conclusion that the decisive blow against the English ruling classes, and it will be decisive for the workers' movement all over the world, cannot be delivered in England, but only in Ireland. On January the 1st, 1870, the General Council issued a confidential circular drawn up by me in French, for only the French journals, not the German ones, produce important repercussions in England, on the relation of the Irish national struggle to the emancipation of the working class, and therefore on the attitude which the International Association should take towards the Irish question. I shall give you here, only quite briefly, the salient points. Ireland is the bulwark of the English landed aristocracy. The exploitation of that country is not only one of the main sources of their material wealth, it is their greatest moral strength. They in fact represent the domination over Ireland. Ireland is therefore the cardinal means by which the English aristocracy maintain their domination in England itself. If, on the other hand, the English army and police were to be withdrawn from Ireland tomorrow, you would at once have an agrarian revolution in Ireland. But the downfall of the English aristocracy in Ireland implies, and has as a necessary consequence, its downfall in England, and this would provide the preliminary condition for the proletarian revolution in England. The destruction of the English landed aristocracy in Ireland is an infinitely easier operation than in England herself, because in Ireland the land question has been, up to now, the exclusive form of the social question, because it is a question of existence, of life and death for the immense majority of the Irish people, and because it is at the same time inseparable from the national question, quite apart from the fact that the Irish character is more passionate and revolutionary than that of the English. As for the English bourgeoisie, it has in the first place a common interest with the English aristocracy in turning Ireland into a mere pasture land, which provides the English market with meat and wool at the cheapest possible prices. It is likewise interested in reducing the Irish population by eviction and forcible emigration to such a small number that English capital invested in land leased for farming, can function there with security. It has the same interest in clearing the estates of Ireland as it has in clearing of the agricultural districts of England and Scotland. The £6,000 to £10,000 absentee landlord and other Irish revenues, which at present flow annually to London, have also to be taken into account. But the English bourgeoisie has much more important interests in the present economy of Ireland. Owing to the constantly increasing concentration of leasehold, Ireland constantly sends her own surplus to the English labour market, and thus forces down wages and lowers the material and moral position of the English working class. And most important of all, every industrial and commercial centre in England now possesses a working class divided into two hostile camps: English proletarians and Irish proletarians. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. In relation to the Irish worker, he regards himself as a member of the ruling nation, and consequently he becomes a tool of the English aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself. He cherishes religious, social and national prejudices against the Irish worker. His attitude towards him is much the same as that of the poor whites to the Negroes in the former slave states of the USA. The Irishman pays him back with interest in his own money. He sees in the English worker both the accomplice and the stupid tool of the English rulers in Ireland. This antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, in short by all the means at the disposal of the ruling classes. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class. Despite its organisation, it is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and that the latter is quite aware of this. So that's a very long quotation, but I think it sort of sums up, as he says, the salient points. Indeed, I think Lenin much more succinctly put it, excuse me, in the in July 1916, an article called "The Discussion of Self-Determination Summed Up," which is mainly concerned with addressing the attitude towards the question of national self-determination in particularly among the Polish Social Democrats. Excuse me. But Lenin does have a rather pithy, I think, sort of summation. Is that that is all there is to it. There is no hint of any repudiation of that elementary socialist principle, which the Poles forget, but to which Marx was always faithful, that no nation can be free if it oppresses other nations. Which is, I think, this a sort of summation. Anyway, there's also, I think, elsewhere, back to the point of the question of the Irish quarter in the industrial and commercial towns of England. It's also in a letter to Bernstein in 1882 that Engels refers to Ireland as the the driving force of the empire, i.e. in the sort of if you go back to the quote I read from Ireland's Revenge, in the sort of what Marx calls the sort of the social, i.e. the existence of a sort of an Irish working class in every substantial commercial and industrial town of any size in England, as well as the political by the presence of the Irish quarter, as he called the Irish Brigade, the Irish quarter as he calls it in Parliament. As I said, that's just I wanted to address in detail that how Marx sort of related to the Irish question there, and then to sort of I think sum up briefly before we then move on to questions. So obviously in the early 20th century, the Irish Parliamentary Party essentially reforms from its two split components back into one led by John Redmond, and you also have these large sort of mass civil society organizations, heavily influenced by Fenians in particular, as well as there is one more organization that's somewhat smaller, but is imported directly from the United States and is a direct corollary to the Horrend Order, that being the Ancient Order of Hibernians, which is also sort of smaller than the other two, which are really mass national organizations. And and becomes so very quickly, but is also present. So then with the re-emergence of the Irish Parliamentary Party into the sort of like political discourse in Britain more broadly, you have obviously first there was obviously a crisis in 1909 with the People's Budget. Excuse me. A budget that was being introduced by the Liberals, which was then defeated in the House of Lords, which caused a constitutional crisis, because of course the Lords at this point still had an absolute veto over any bill. And so then there is an election held, or two elections actually, which returned near sort of similar results, with a clear majority in favour of abolishing the Lords' veto. And then there is which is then passed with the Liberal Prime Minister Herbert Asquith threatening to create more Liberal peers if the Lords didn't agree to abolish their own veto. However, Asquith then obviously, the Liberals are in power, but they're also they don't have an overall majority and are reliant upon Redmond's Irish Parliamentary Party for support. And then Redmond demands the introduction of what then becomes the Third Home Rule Bill, which is introduced then in 1912, which at this time is a sort of institutes a much more sort of serious crisis, in that there now isn't like an absolute veto, whereas previously it had always been presumed that the House of Lords would always veto a Home Rule Bill. And given that veto was now removed, there's a real possibility of it coming into effect. So in September 1912, you have the signing by several 100,000 northern Protestants, or Unionists, of what becomes known as the Ulster Covenant, which takes its name from the covenant between the Scottish and English Parliaments in 1642, the Solemn League and Covenant, and is essentially a contract signed between themselves, essentially pledging to oppose Home Rule by any means necessary, to which they are backed by the Conservative Party. Given they both see this, they conceive of this as Home Rule is threatening the unity of the empire, and so they attempt to oppose Home Rule by any means necessary. So then you also have the following on in a practical sense from the Ulster Covenant, the formation of what becomes the Ulster Volunteer Force, which is essentially a militia to oppose Home Rule. And then the sort of following year, excuse me, you have the formation of, at the explicit prompting of the IRB, although this was not widely known at the time, the formation of the Irish Volunteers, which is the IRB, which had been revitalised in the early 20th century, as well as I mentioned earlier, solidifying into the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Excuse me. Seeing this as a means of creating essentially an army for independence, so the Irish Volunteers, nominally under the control of, technically under the control of John Redmond. And this then creates a continual constitutional crisis in Britain. Indeed, I always remember in the Fall of Eagles episode, about the outbreak of war. Kaiser Wilhelm, his Chancellor, Bethmann Holtzwig says to him that England is presently sort of concerned with the vexed question of Ireland, and what this really means is there are two very large forces in Ireland, both of whom smuggle in rifles from Germany and large amounts of ammunition, both prepared to both implement and oppose Home Rule, both supported broadly by either the Conservatives on the one hand and the Liberals on the other, and at an impasse. Excuse me. Then obviously you have the outbreak of war, and the Home Rule sort of question is sort of shelved until after the war. And then obviously you have in Easter 1916 an attempted rebellion, sort of using the rump of the Irish volunteers, if you will, sort of as Redmond had sort of implored the volunteers to join the British Army to fight in the First World War, as of course did the Ulster Volunteer Force, as a means of sort of demonstrating their loyalty in order to ensure that Home Rule would be implemented, or not implemented, as the case in the case of EVF. So they attempted to use the IRB, and then obviously they incorporate what's known as the Irish Citizen Army, headed by James Connolly, a sort of working class. Yes, that one there. Yes. Rather excellent picture that Frank found on the poster. Which was a working class, like force of its own, is incorporated because the members of the IRB are fearful that they will detect, or they will clamp down on these the Irish Citizen Army, sort of linked to the the Socialist Party, and so Connolly is sort of brought on side for the rising, which is then defeated. There are 13 of the leaders are then, 14 is it, are then executed after the rising is defeated, as well as the sort of solidify a series of events, both the threat of the introduction of conscription, which had been introduced in Great Britain in 1915 but hadn't been introduced to Ireland, and various other events. The rising becomes both associated with Sinn Féin, which has been a small political party founded in 1904 as a nationalist party, but initially its goal was the establishment of a sort of Austro-Hungarian model of joint sort of an equal status in between Great Britain and Ireland, which is then becomes associated with the Easter Rising, is then sort of essentially taken over by members of the IRB and sort of these other various, its founder Arthur Griffiths and these other various nationalists sort of wind up in the same party, and you then in the general election in 1918 decimate the Irish Parliamentary Party, and this party, going back to its founding, had a policy of abstentionism. However, under De Valera, this one of the leaders of the 1916 Rising who wasn't executed, Eamon De Valera, who then becomes president, the leader of Sinn Féin, who's important. He should be sticking around for a while. They then proclaim themselves the Irish Parliament of the Independent Irish Republic, proclaimed in 1916, and proceed then. What then proceeds is the War of Independence from 1919 until 1921, in which firstly, in 1920, as a means of trying to respond to the escalating problems, the British government imposed this form of home rule, which it had been committed to, introducing home rule, but one of the sort of key stumbling block with the third home rule bill was about the exclusion of the majority Protestant counties in the northeast part of the island. Excuse me. I.e. where there were large majorities who opposed home rule. So they opposed home rule, and the Irish Parliamentary Party opposed any form of partition in any way. So the Parliament in 1920 then imposes partition and creates two home rule parliaments, one in Belfast, in what it called Northern Ireland, and another one in Dublin, in what was called then Southern Ireland. And this then sort of serves as the basis then for, in 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, whereby the Southern Ireland, which had, it had elected, I think, all bar one of its, there were elections held to these two home rule parliaments, and all bar one was a Sinn Féin candidate that returned unopposed in 1920. They use this as the formation of what then becomes called the Irish Free State, which is a dominion of the British Commonwealth, and Northern Ireland, which has the right to opt out of the treaty and remain part of the United Kingdom, which it then exercises. And there was then a brief civil war over those who opposed the treaty and those who support it. And the opposition mainly sort of centres around either the sort of question of the oath of allegiance and thus the position as a member of the Commonwealth. The question of partition had been sort of parked by there was an idea for a boundary commission, and was put off until some future date. But eventually the pro-treaty forces win. It comes to an end then in 1922 to 23, and really then that's the solidifying of the Irish state as it is today. We'll stop there and take questions.
Okay, thank you. There's a huge amount of material there.
I know. That's paired to the bones, by the way.
Does anyone want to start?
Oh, well, I was just going to throw a quite broad one about just, I guess especially with Connolly, but because also what the left has to do with this history in particular as well. So
right.
I'm aware that I think Lenin and Trotsky and kind of understand 1916 to be a kind of prelude to 1917 in some sense.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of regard it as a sort of premature revolution in some sense, right? That the World War I kind of isn't at the point where where something like 1917 would be possible, or the Russian Revolution would be possible. So 1916 has a kind of aborted character. But also I kind of wonder about that because it seems like, unlike in Germany or Russia, that the actual sort of role of people like Connolly and organisations surrounding him are quite marginal. He seems quite sort of aloof from the Ulster or the the Irish nationalist movement in a certain sense, but also there isn't much of.
There isn't very large. There isn't the mass socialist party.
Right, exactly, and
everything was only a few hundred people, wasn't it?
Yeah,
quite small.
Yeah.
Well, it was
Sure. So I guess but that said, whenever the IMT, for example, go out on rallies, they have they have like portraits of like the canonical like
Marx,
Engels, Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, and James Connolly. Like what? And so it's a curious thing. So it seems like people still seem like compelled by this history, or it seems to kind of speak to a certain like unfinished business or something. But also there are all these kind of qualifiers on that. So, what do you make of that?
I mean, I think I'm trying to think. Where is the Lenin has this quote. This is also from that. Title escapes me now. The summing up of the issue of self-determination. Yeah, it's still. He has this quote towards the end where he talks about, like the Easter Rising. It is not clear that it is least of all permissible to contrast Europe to the colonies in this respect. The struggle, the oppressed nations of Europe, the oppressed nations of Europe, a struggle capable of going all the way to insurrection and street fighting, capable of breaking down the iron discipline of the army and martial law, will sharpen the revolutionary crisis in Europe to an infinitely greater degree than a much more developed rebellion in a remote colony. A blow delivered against the power of the English imperialist bourgeoisie by rebellion in Ireland is 100 times more significant politically than the blow of equal force delivered in Asia or Africa. So I suppose this sort of and this I think applies also to Connolly very much as well, is that they saw, the rebellion in Ireland and more broadly the question of Irish independence. It's a political judgment, I suppose, is the first thing I would say. I.e. that they saw it as, undermining, the British imperial state, and thus sharpening, the potential for world revolution. So even like the marginal character of, say, the socialist movement in Ireland is, for someone like Lenin, and this is. There are quite sharp divisions in obviously the Second International and afterwards around these types of questions. But Lenin obviously is clearly, in favour of it as making revolution more possible. And I suppose the other point I would make is that it's also important then to bear in mind the bourgeois character of the this political demand for independence. I think Lenin also addresses this in the pamphlet, the article. That there isn't in for Marx there wouldn't be, if you will, a qualitative difference in terms of the economic or political the way in which you would treat the economic or political demands, and that they're both contradictory sort of demands, being there's still both expressions of the sort of crisis of bourgeois society and the sort of capitalism. So in that sense I would say that you would also say that supporting this demand is also in the sense that this is a demand being generated by society in this way, which even if achieved would still not solve the problem of capitalism, and so there's potential there to build the consciousness of the proletariat, both in Ireland and also we'd say in England and elsewhere. I don't know if that's.
I guess that what I was trying to get at was the concept of Connolly's socialism, and this question of was global civil war for socialism on the agenda in World War One, and there's parallel with like I don't know, the later Third International policy on like anti-colonial revolts and things like that. But it does seem like a kind of interesting thing that that Connolly is kind of held up as like as a kind of figure in the history of like Marxism rather than in the history of Irish nationalism or something.
Right.
And that's the thing. That's
right. I see.
Curious.
I mean, in the history of like nationalism, he's just reduced to like he's just like another like rebel on like the order of that was the most famous is Padraig Pearse, but a whole slew of others. He's just another like rebel, but someone more on the side of like the working man or something. Whereas I think you're right. There is this way in which he's like upheld by like elements of the left. there are like different things. Firstly, like the Stalinists, as in like the official communists, are like fascinated by like this question of like Ireland, and there is a lot of like literature on the subject. Particularly, I think the 1930s, particularly around like the half centenary, in 1966. So there's a way in which I think Connolly is sort of appropriated in a certain sense. Is sort of like Stalinized in a way, because he was he was a member obviously of the Socialist Party in the United States. He founded the Socialist Party in Ireland. He opposed the the sort of like sellout in the First World War. He opposed the sort of, for example, like the SPD, for example, voting for the war credits. So he is sort of.
He was backed by the Social Democratic Federation in England.
Mm-hmm.
And he ran for Parliament, I think, in.
Yes. When was it?
1910, something around then.
Yeah. I think it was 1910. There is like another like subplot, which is that there was a sort of it's like separately organised. There were like two sort of socialist parties in Ireland. There was sort of like Connolly's one, which is the one the Second International sort of like recognised and sort of had dealings with more broadly, and the sort of a sort of a separate one in like Belfast, oriented. As Connolly would sort of. I have. Show you still here. This James Connolly reader by published last year by a Cliffite, an Irish Cliffite, Sean Harkin. And in it, there's obviously a lot of things, but one of the things Connolly is attacking is a sort of like pro-unionist, this like pro-unionist like socialists, as being sort of like if he doesn't, I think he calls them revisionists at one point, but the I suppose that question, there is actually this way in which because I sort of do this myself in one sense. Like, is Connolly really a Marxist at all? And I think this is in part, in large part, I think, due to the way he's like picked up by the left, and the fact that he dies in 1916, sort of before, I don't know, nailing he could or could not have like nailed his colours to the mast, I suppose, in terms of like 1917. So he becomes this sort of ambiguous figure that can be appropriated by, I think has been appropriated by like Stalinism, which then sort of calls into question, well, is he really a sort of a Marxist at all? And you could probably make criticisms, but I would still generously attribute to him the title of a Marxist.
I just say hello.
Hi, Sophia.
Sorry, I'm a bit late, but I was just interested in his help.
Yeah, if you want to, don't be shy to ask questions and stop him and say please.
Tell me to shut up occasionally.
Yeah. I guess I want to go back to the earlier part of this 1841 to 1923 section, Ireland, Marxism and Ireland. And the quotes you talked about from Marx, Marx talking about O'Connell and the Litchfield Agreement.
Right.
And because I think the central issue that came out throughout that part, and then it's kind of the backstory to the issues of 1916, of Connolly, is the issue of working class political independence, right? So not being led by bourgeois liberals,
or the clergy, or the aristocracy,
or the aristocracy, right? Exactly. So, what's kind of what's missing from your presentation is Chartism, is the issue of proletarian political independence in England.
Right, that's, I did flag it up, I think.
Yeah, but it's kind of there in the background. What I was struck by was the parallel between the role that the 1832 Reform Act and the Corn Laws play in terms of getting working class support for liberals, to what Marx is saying about how the issue of repealing the Act of Union of Home Rule is used by O'Connell to kind of get working class support for what would become the Irish Brigade, as Marx calls it, and that it's a way of chaining the working class to kind of liberal misleadership.
Right.
So there's a way in which Marx seems to be analogizing the issue of Irish nationalism, or Irish independence even, to the issue of the independence of the working class in England, and he sees very similar problems, and that's why it's striking the way you quote him talking about the Fenians as being the first time that the Irish masses have not been led by the clergy or the liberal bourgeoisie. And so in a way he's there kind of analogizing the Fenians to the idea of working class independence. And that seems to be politically motivated by the position of the International Working Men's Association and the First International, and trying to kind of galvanise and generate the
consciousness of the English working class,
consciousness of the necessity for political independence through this kind of example of the Fenians. But what it turns out is that by the time that doesn't happen,
right?
And actually, the way you kind of narrate the history is that by the 1880s, 1890s, the Fenians retreat to essentially
liberalism.
It's even sub-liberalism, right? Because it becomes the cultural Gaelic nationalism,
right,
which has a certain kind of reactionary character to it in some ways. And it's also about the reunification with the Irish Parliamentary Party eventually. And there's a way in which Sinn Féin emerges as a kind of the signal of the non-independence of the Fenians from the bourgeois, from middle class concerns.
Right.
I mean, I'm just kind of
trying
to digest everything.
Oh yeah, I know. I suppose one point I would add is that obviously the masses that Marx is predominantly referring to are back to the question of land. After you see 1903, you have the Wyndham's Land Purchase Act in 1903, which is essentially where it's the culmination of the land war, where all of these tenants are simply advanced loans by the government to buy they're like farms essentially from, predominantly obviously capitalist at this point. So the sort of masses he's sort of like referring to are, in a sense, predominantly not proletarians in the first instance. So they're like,
And also the imagination of the revolution is bourgeois democratic.
Right.
And the idea of what was the poster I saw? It's the kind of yeomanry, like everyone will have their parcel of land, they'll own it themselves. It's an attempt to restore bourgeois society that's falling apart in Ireland.
Exactly.
Obviously, what's kind of the tragic character of Ireland is that the attempts that emerge in the mid-19th century to restore bourgeois society through some kind of liberal revolution are already too late, and bourgeois society's being undermined, so they appear kind of they're backwards looking.
Right, and that's where, of course, their like conservative elements like emerge from.
Yeah, and why they so easily kind of flip-flop in relationship to people like O'Connell.
Connolly.
Connolly.
Yes, exactly. And it's also, I mean, that's, one like other point I might add is, it's just to like emphasize the fact that there is like, a Connolly, if you will, towards which they like flip-flop, if you will. I mentioned, the sort of, the original like distinction, as I said, between what did IRB mean. You could attribute that in a large part to the growth and emergence of the Socialist International on this like global sort of level. There actually was a sort of this other like revolutionary movement, which in one sense I think makes the sort of sort of Republican, to use the sort of term they then use, character of like the IRB, i.e. the sort of like bourgeois democratic character more sort of latent, in that there is actually this other like socialist movement for the dictatorship of the proletariat and the overthrow of capitalism existing, which again it goes back to sort of the point I was making earlier, that Lenin or Connolly even believed that, well, even this like bourgeois democratic sort of movement could perhaps be utilized for some sort of or play some role in sort of making the sort of ground more fertile for international like socialist revolution. So I suppose the the question is obviously, well, and I think this goes back to like Marx's point, which is that he was saying that, well, independence for Ireland could allow a sort of revolutionary like mass socialist party essentially to emerge in England.
Well, I thought what was interesting about that Marx quote was the emphasis on the way you summarised it from Lenin, which is the no nation can be free if it oppresses another nation,
right,
which is kind of classically vulgarised or kind of simplified on the left today.
It's like it's taken as the former because of the latter rather than the latter because of the former.
Right, exactly.
Right? Sorry, so the former.
No nation can be free if it oppresses other nations. So it's taken to be because you're oppressing other nations,
you're
that
unfree.
might affect you.
Yes.
Rather Marx's point is that Britain is unfree, which is why it's doing what it's doing in Ireland.
But it is also the case of the way in which the necessity of the political independence of the English working class isn't posed or is masked by the Irish question, and that
removing the mask, as it were.
That removing the mask, so that you could say something similar of like Well, perhaps analogously, you could say something similar of like free trade, which is that the Corn Laws, the fact that the Corn Laws were still in place, may obscured the necessity for working class independence in England, and the Liberals were able to kind of garner working class support for them, and it was only the point would be that the question would be posed more bluntly after they were repealed.
One other point I would like, I didn't make in the sort of presentation because it was sort of, slightly sort of off-piste, but, there's a letter, I think, in 1884 from Engels to Kautsky, where he talks about the duty to support, like, the independence of Ireland and Poland.
Ireland
and Poland.
Yeah.
While at the same time, he sort of goes on to say, which Lenin also touches on, I think, in this article, which I would recommend you read. It's a real great companion, actually, to the imperialism pamphlet which we read this week. But i.e. that in the same letter, Engels sort of opposes, this idea of pan-Slavism in Herzegovina as a sort of banner of convenience for Tsarist imperialism. It's not all nations all of the time in this ahistorical sort of even apolitical way. It's these are sort of concrete political sort of back to that Lenin quote that pan-Slavism is simply expanding the oppression of other nations by Tsarism, and is therefore not something to support, whereas these other demands could serve the role of potentially sort of developing the consciousness of the proletariat.
Ultimately not what happened though.
Right.
I mean, it's a really peculiar period, the bit you get into towards the end of the 1890s and the turn of the century, where in the UK a Conservative government is returned with mass working class support.
Right.
And you get crises like the Boer War and the kind of and the emergence of the Labour Party, which kind of assumes the liberal position on Ireland.
I think we'll touch maybe more on the Labour Party, third one. The Labour Party is interesting in one sense, in that it assumes this position, but it's not in this early part of the 20th century, but it's not in power, or anywhere near power in many ways. And it has a very different character, even when it first comes to power. I think one way I think of, I was reading recently about a historian who put it, the Labour Party had neither, on the Irish question, the Labour Party had neither a history to live down or to live up to, as opposed to the Liberals or even the Conservatives. And so throughout much of the 20th century, it's sort of the status quo sort of whatever.
That's interesting because it points to the Labour Party not assuming the inheritance of the tradition of the First International, which is what Marx is trying to cultivate, this kind of, what position on Ireland are the working men of England
going to adopt, right,
and why? Obviously, the other question that's really brought up there is just the more basic, that this period that you're addressing, 1841 to 1923, is the period of kind of, the early part of it is this proletarianization and the impact that the Irish workers coming to England has on the English working class and on Chartism. I do like Thomas Carlyle's phrase, he calls them the sans potato instead of the sans caloot. What will we do with these sans potatoes?
That's brilliant anyway.
But you know, and Marx like just straightforwardly points out why the English working class have anti-Irish prejudice, because it's lowering their standard of living, the price of labour, increasing competition for jobs.
The Industrial Reserve Army.
The Industrial Reserve Army. Points which you kind of just couldn't make on the left today without being called some kind of xenophobe. And the I guess that problem is never actually resolved in a British Socialist Party. In the even in trade unionism in the 1860s, and it is posed quite interestingly in Chartism, where you have like prominent Irish people involved in leading Chartism, and the question of Ireland is actually posed, and then it kind of disappears in some way, and it kind of seems intractable in terms of building a mass socialist party in the UK.
I mean, let me just make a couple of other points. I mean, one is obviously just like to emphasize, obviously, you know, what I really liked about one of the Marx quotes is, you know, he emphasized that, you know, it's like the English working class, it's like their own sort of you know, enslavement that they sort of, you know, perpetuate by you know, supporting you know, the sort of bourgeoisie sort of rule in Ireland, which is you know, completely different from, you know, the sort of notion of you know, solidarity that you hear nowadays on the part of you know, the guilty sort of you know, English people or something, that they tell you to do nowadays, which it's their own self-interest that you're appealing to, in this bourgeois fashion, you know, rather than some sort of sense of guilt or something.
Absolutely. Well, one thing I just asked, I mean, there's a lot to ask as well. We didn't really get into we didn't really get into 1912 to 1916.
Right.
Because obviously there's huge changes in that period, and the kind of semi-radicalization of the IRB, where it's seemed to shift rightwards towards the end of the 19th century, and then it appears in this kind of left-wing character.
I'll see you guys on Thursday.
Thanks, Evan.
See you Thursday. Appears to have this more left-wing character in the crisis leading up to and during the First World War. But that's obviously a very dubious kind.
Right.
Which is the point I made earlier about Sinn Féin. But I guess one question is whether or not by the time it gets to the Third Home Rule Bill in 1912, it's not already a conservative and conservatizing prospect. You know, that it leads to the conservative outcome of the development of Ulster unionist militias, and so the idea of organising cross green and orange working class party,
right,
just disappears,
right,
and then that's kind of which would obviously be the point, right?
I mean, there's an interesting point, Connolly makes precisely this point on the question of partition in this period. Let's see, where is it? The betrayal of the national democracy of industrial Ulster would mean a carnival of reaction both north and south, would set back the wheels of progress, would destroy the oncoming unity of the Irish labour movement, and paralyse all advanced movements while it lasted. And since that's of course what happens.
And it's just the kind of crying shame is that in 1912, when the Third Home Rule Bill is posed, there's no working class alternative. In either England or Ireland, it really sets those wheels in motion.
Right.
And obviously, it's contingent upon more broadly, that there is the possibility of revolution in Germany
Exactly.
before and after the war, and then in Russia, but obviously the failure of that has deep ramifications in Ireland and beyond.
You would also sort of goes back to the point that Engels made about Ireland being like the driving force of the empire. It's the way in which, if you will, like the empire, the imperial state, and obviously like colonialism is sort of a means of like, if you will, managing like the crisis of the union in some ways. And it's sort of like, so you're trapped in this, almost this like contradictory sort of, phrase of where, or like point of where, Ireland is like the sort of spur for the sort of imperial state, the Bonapartist state, and at the same time, it's the need to like overcome the sort of that like the state and the sort of like crisis of capitalism, which would necessarily like solve the sort of question.
And you said before how O'Connell, is just remembered as a kind of a rebel.
Connolly, yes.
And that's the kind of like I think typical view on the left, which is the kind of the brave, rebellious Irish, and it kind of ignores this question of organising Irish labour, as he puts it, which would not have a kind of community character to it. There is some projection. I mean, I'm sure you'll talk about this later, but some projection of the community politics back onto 1916.
Right.
We should move on to the final instalment. It did occur to me, you mentioned before this, maybe this is like a transition point, but you mentioned before that James Joyce saying, escaping the nightmare of history and this kind of Irish problem. But he's obviously saying that right around this time.
Right.
I don't know when the quote's exactly from, but
it's Ulysses.
It's
the
in
start of Ulysses.
So
and it's told by Stephen Dedalus, who's like
right.
Joyce himself, sort of the standard.
So published 1921, 22.
It was a bit later, was it not? I mean, it takes place, is it not in?
I think it's 1922, but it's obviously he's been writing it for a while. But
I thought it was 24. Anyway.
Okay, maybe. But I guess that kind of adds some ambiguity to what's remembered as the kind of the most, in some ways, remembered as the most left-wing, most like kind of revolutionary period in the question of Irish liberation. But then kind of also seems like the sinking into a nightmare.
Right.